Hello and welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Los Angeles, but recently returned from the Finger Lakes region of New York. Just a couple of weeks ago, Wendy and I took a trip to upstate New York. We traveled all over the Finger Lakes and Catskill Mountains and visited family and some friends who do some incredible farming and make some incredible wine and cider, or at least they would if they had any fruit. I say that because this year, following a very warm April, an unseasonably, maybe record-setting warm April, which caused the trees to bloom and set fruit, in mid-May, the entire Northeast experienced a freeze event, much worse than any late frost, in which temperature was around 25 degrees Fahrenheit for about 5 hours one night. When it hit, it destroyed one of the biggest blooms the area had seen in years. Now many orchards are simply barren. I walked through hundreds of trees that had no fruit at all. This came after last year's off year, when most of the trees produced a greatly reduced crop as part of their evolved cyclical reproductive schedule. I can't imagine trying to operate my winery in California without grapes for 2 years, but that's exactly what many cider makers in the Northeast face right now. And grapes have been affected as well, but it remains to be seen just how badly. I kept hearing a phrase that has sort of haunted me. Everyone kept saying, quote, never before. Never before. That's how the severity of this freeze event was described. I began writing this while stranded in a hotel in Geneva, New York. I say stranded because our flight back to LA was canceled and we couldn't get another flight for 3 days. And I was stranded due to the air quality as well. The air quality index, as I started to write this, was close to 200. That means that there, on the verdant shores of Lake Seneca, in a quaint town surrounded by farms and forests, the air outside was the most polluted and unhealthy air on the planet because of, again, unprecedented wildfires in Canada. This, too, seems to be a never-before event. I've gotten used to never before because of living in California. In my 26 years of living in Los Angeles, I've lived through multiple of the driest years on record for the western United States. During that time, I also saw and breathed the smoke of fires that were the largest and most destructive ever seen in the West. And now, the 2022-23 winter will go down as one of the wettest winters on record. Extremity and severity are our future. Never before is happening every year now. Never before is a phrase that will become common to all of us, wherever we live. As I sat trapped in my hotel writing about this, I looked around and saw a lobby area full of dozens of people who seemed completely unperturbed by these ecological and environmental realities, visible right outside the window in the extremely hazy air. I began to feel discouraged. I'm sure you've been there. What will it take to wake us up? But then I remembered some other ecological realities I'd noticed during our visit to New York. The farmers themselves were one of these realities. Dismayed, for sure, but undaunted. This never-before spring was already activating deep wells of creativity and resourcefulness in everyone I spoke to. More than ever before, diversity was rising to the top of the list of paths into the future. And I don't know if you've ever experienced living through a terrible storm or flood or earthquake or other natural calamity, but if you have, you've probably experienced that sense of community that happens when the dust settles and everyone comes out to survey the damage, and people begin to spontaneously talk to each other and make sure that everyone is okay and help with anything that they can. I felt this sense of community on an almost regional scale in New York. The farmers were commiserating, sharing, checking on each other, trying to learn from each other, offering help to each other. Our car service driver was another of these ecological realities that encouraged me. When our flight was canceled and every rental car place was sold out for 100 miles, we called a car service to be dropped at a nearby hotel to wait out our multi-day unplanned stay. But when our driver heard our story, he refused to let us be the battered victims of fate. He inspired us to call the airline and find a flight on a day earlier out of another airport and promised to get us there. He drove us an hour and a half, twice, on 2 separate days, picking us up the second time, even though we had to stay an hour and a half from where he lived. On top of this, he had an infectiously positive attitude, carried our bags, recommended hotels, and gave us receipts so that we could get reimbursed for our unexpected travel expenses. It occurred to me that when things happen that have never happened before, we get to see people act in ways that they have never had the opportunity to act before. yes, at times we can be discouraging, but we are almost never always discouraging. We can be, and often are, creative, resourceful, caring, inspiring, heroic, and compassionate in ways that can change people's lives. As one farmer I talked to said, only a tiny percentage of people are crazy. The rest of us just want to pay our bills and get along. I've dedicated Centralis, my winery, and the Organic Wine Podcast to promoting the knowledge and practices that reduce the number of times we have these never-before events. I've used these businesses to ask how to build a wine culture that is so diverse and adaptable that it can weather whatever comes. I've dedicated my time and resources to inspiring you to rise to the challenges of the future and act in ways that you never have before, in the best sense. And I've reached a point where I want to do more. I want to work on projects that will extend beyond my lifetime to an unlimited number of generations from now. So I'm putting together a business plan, and I'm looking for an investor or investors who share this vision and would like to build something inspiring, hopeful, beautiful, and delicious that also regenerates the earth and builds the health of the land and the community of living creatures who are part of it. If you have a serious interest in supporting this kind of project financially, please reach out to me at connect@organicwinepodcast.com, and we can schedule a call to discuss if it might be a good fit for you. And if you aren't an investor, I'm still excited for you to be part of this future project in other ways, and I will keep you posted as it develops. In the meantime, I'm going to show some love to a farmer and buy some delicious wine and cider. Now, on to this episode, which is pretty special. My guest for this episode is Mike Biltonen. Mike is the co-owner with his wife of Know Your Roots, an orchard and vineyard consultation and management business in the Northeast U.S. Mike has spent almost 40 years working with orchards, vineyards, and other specialty crops. He's farmed in Virginia, Minnesota, Vermont, California, and New York. Over the past 20 years, his passion for sustainable agriculture has evolved into a profound dedication to the principles and practices of ecologically focused biodynamic agriculture. He serves as the president of the Josephine Porter Institute for Applied Biodynamics. For the last 15 years, Mike has consulted for orchardists and farmers while also operating his own biodynamically enlivened orchard and mushroom operation in central New York. He keeps alive the legacy of his friend, the late Michael Phillips, and helps maintain Phillips Holistic Orchard Network. This was a very special conversation for many reasons, not the least of which was because it was the first in-person interview I've done on location. Mike was gracious enough to spend a morning guiding me through his newly established Apostrophe orchard. As we walk through the trees and other plants, Mike gives us an incredible tour of an orchard established and maintained ecologically with the principles and practices of biodynamics and a permaculture perspective. You'll hear the sounds of birds and orchard life all around us in the background as we talk. Since this happened within the context of the freeze event that left no fruit on the trees of Apostrophe Orchard, we discuss what the future of pomiculture and agriculture might look like from both a big perspective and a technical, holistic orchard care perspective. This in-depth conversation culminates in a discussion of high-frequency beverages and how human energy has a vital impact on the farm environment and its products. And this is just part one. In part two, to be released soon, we leave the orchard and walk into the forest, and the conversation becomes influenced by things more ancient, primal, mystical, and even magical by the end. So stay tuned and enjoy.
Well, I'll start by saying then that Mike Biltonen, and thank you very much for coming out to Apostrophe Orchard today, which I've named it. Yes.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, there's actually a Frank Zappa song where they talk about how the apostrophe is like the answer to it all because it brings things together.
Okay.
And there's a very long description that Frank didn't actually give. Right. But that his son Dweezil gave, which if you Google it, it's a very long explanation, and the song is very bizarre. But I like the whole idea of naming something that was like, it was like bringing things together. It was, coalescing, different elements of nature with, our involvement as farmers and growers, with what the land had to offer. So, to some degree, that to me speaks to this concept of terroir more than anything. It's like, because terroir is not any one thing. It's like all these things that are kind of brought together.
Yeah.
And so that's how Apostrophe came about. And my wife and I co-own Know Your Roots, so this is basically a project of Know Your Roots. Debbie's a community herbalist, and I'm the farmer, as she likes to say. So she's the forager, and I'm the farmer. I've been farming for 40 years now, and I started out at a very large commercial orchard in central Virginia. I didn't know how large at the time, but it was 1,500 acres, 900 acres of apples, 600 acres of peaches, very conventional. I was totally blind going in. I had no idea how actually destructive it was, just with all the pesticide use. But nonetheless, that's kind of where I cut my teeth and got to understand a lot of things. I had a really good mentor there who became one of my best friends as well. And so we spent a lot of off-hours time just talking about, orcharding and life and everything else. I left that orchard in 1989, went to Cornell, got my master's degree in pomology, started a PhD project, left that because I really wanted to be in the field, went to Minnesota to work at a large orchard out there, which was basically the home of the Honeycrisp apple. And that was a very different but very enriching, rewarding experience because I was able to really begin to work towards this idea of what implementable integrated pest management meant. Whereas at my previous job, it was just sort of calendar spraying. I mean, it wasn't quite totally blind like that, but it was very much, you would just go spray, kill everything you could, and then you do it again in 2 weeks. Whereas at Pepin Heights Orchard, it was more of it was a real learning experience, and there was a lot of flexibility to learn about things, to do research, to investigate, and also to grow a crop of apples that was there. And it was interesting because it also was synced up with when a certified organic standard had just started to come into play. There was finally real exposure to what kind of sprays were going on in conventional orcharding. There was the whole Alar incident at the end of the 80s, and then Meryl Streep got involved, Mothers and Others for a Livable Planet, NRCS, not NRCS, National Resources Defense Fund got involved, and consumers became much more aware of where their food was coming from, and particularly with apples now kind of in the spotlight. And so while we certainly weren't organic, and in the early 90s we were always told that unless you were like really small scale backyard you couldn't be organic, I started asking those questions. And in 1999, when I moved back to New York, I was in the Hudson Valley for a few years. I kept pursuing and pushing harder, asking those questions. And I have to say that Michael Phillips, who was a good friend of mine and wrote several very seminal books on holistic orcharding, was one that I think really began to help us all understand that this was something possible that could happen. And it was more than just about how do we grow organic apples. It was like, how can we really work within the orchard environment in a very cohesive way, having a light touch, working with all the things that to a large degree the academic world was telling us were relatively unimportant. And that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down another time. And then I was at an orchard in the Hudson Valley for a few years, and then I took a job out here at Red Jacket Orchards in Geneva. I was there for 4 years, and then I decided to go into consulting full time. And then, like I was saying earlier, in 2015, I started grafting all these trees with the idea of let's have a real orchard. Let's see what we can do with it, and let's begin to explore some of these concepts a little more deeply. And that also brought me into biodynamics, etc. And here we are today.
Well, your involvement with biodynamics coincided with the start of Apostrophe Orchard?
No, I was interested, but not as involved with biodynamics even before Apostrophe.
Okay.
But it wasn't something that I could actively pursue because my bosses were it was just like something that was very foreign to them.
Yeah.
But here I could begin to do that, and the more that I got involved with biodynamics, several organizations, etc., the more I could talk to people in a way that they could relate to what biodynamics meant to them. So we didn't immediately go down that rabbit hole of the cosmic woo-woo type of stuff, but we could talk about how, practical biodynamics is really just being about a good regenerative farmer, and how all these other things they add to that in a really big way. Because if you're not already a good farmer, a good orchardist, biodynamics isn't going to do much for you, and so you have to kind of layer these things in.
Right.
So, yeah.
You were talking about going down that rabbit hole of all the things that weren't considered important by science. We're both pretty far down that rabbit hole, I think, consistently.
Yeah.
And Apostrophe, it's nice just to start here maybe because we're standing next to a guild. If you want to talk about, I don't know, maybe just since we're standing here, just talk about what a guild is and what you were doing when you planted this little area.
Sure. Well, permaculture is actually something that I came to at about the same time I came to biodynamics. I knew of it, and I'll be perfectly honest that my brain was still kind of entrained to my academic years and working in the industry for a long time, and so it's hard for me to kind of figure out how that worked into being a commercial orchardist, because at the end of the day, as I tell people, if this isn't financially viable in some way, shape, or form, you're just not going to be doing it for very long.
Right.
And particularly like after this year where we had this big freeze, there are people who are set up to be able to weather that, and there are other people who aren't. But that said, then I started thinking about and reading about what other plants meant to that apple tree. And a lot of this then relates to things that Elaine Ingham and Michael Phillips were talking about, which is that mycorrhizal network. And then, of course, there's Paul Stamets and everybody else who's talking about that underground neural network, et And so I started thinking about complementary plants that could work in a guild with the primary plant crop, which would be apples in this case. That would generate some other type of a crop, but would also help to diversify the mycorrhizal network that's underneath the ground, because one of the things that I found out is that the less diverse the above ground part, the less diverse the orchard ecosystem is, the less diverse the mycorrhizal network is. And so, because sometimes mycorrhizae and some plants have very specific mycorrhizal associations. So if we can diversify that in a way that's complementary, both economically, ecologically, mycorrhizally, we can begin to, I think, enliven that soil in a way that goes beyond just putting compost or wood chips or, whatever you're doing down there. And so these initial guilds I planted, that there's the hosta berry that's here, there's olali berry that's here, there's the apple. And those are the three that are in here right now. And you can see that the hosta berry has gotten quite big.
Yeah, it looks happy.
But the other thing is kind of a very unintentional thing is to allow other plants to come in and, through what I'm calling selective weeding, allow things that are non-competitive that could be beneficial to stay within that guild, and to take out other things. So things like grasses, which, they provide good hay and they're mulch and stuff, so I have no problem kind of trimming them down and leaving them there. But over here, we've got things like there's some red clover that's in here. We've got yarrow, which is the primary biodynamic herb.
Right.
You can see the olali berries are just kind of popping up all over the place. There's other types of, flowering plants that are going to come in. And you begin to, really, and there's daisies, of course, and you really kind of enrich the whole environment around the tree. And that, to me, it's not, I wouldn't say that's strictly by definition kind of a Bill Mollison permaculture guild, but to me, it's something that's allowing for that environment to build around that apple tree.
To be diverse and to have a community rather than like a monoculture. And I guess if you're a gardener, maybe companion planting is the idea of a guild, right? Like
it's a very similar,
like
concept.
A simplified version of it.
Yeah.
Well, now I have a really interesting. My mind is racing because you said some people were set up to deal with this crazy freeze event that you had in May. How were they set up? Like, what did that look like? Did anybody survive that? Like,
well, Some people did survive it. Yeah, I mean,
were there things you could do even if you were in a freeze-prone area to save the fruit?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's an area of research that really needs to happen. The problem is that in an in situ situation in an orchard, you can't predict when you're going to get those events. So you can't really set up an experiment to say, well, this worked and that didn't.
Right.
But I think conceptually there are things that we can begin to be prepared for. Okay. And with the unpredictable nature of the weather, whether it's in the middle of the summer or in the winter or early spring, whatever, I think we have to start to just be prepared to do certain things, or if we don't want to do those certain things, just be prepared for the repercussions of that.
So, like, what would those things be? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so typically grape growers and apple growers, you would use wind machines or fires.
Right.
And it could be smudge pots or it could be open fires.
Right.
But there's a whole other line of investigation that we really haven't explored, which is supercharging essentially the problem is, I guess the objective is that what we want to do is we want to be able to prevent two things during a frost or freeze event. One, we want to be able to drop the freezing point of the cytoplasm in the cells. Okay, and the other is that we want to prevent ice nucleation on the surface of the plant. Mm-hmm. And if we can do those two things, then we provide a modicum of protection to the plant. Now, it's only going to be marginal. If it went down to 18 degrees, we're kind of like,
yeah.
Kissing our collective butts goodbye.
Yeah.
But when it gets down to like 29, 30, 28, 27, if we can somehow figure out to buy 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees of protection by reducing the freezing point of the cells, or preventing ice nucleation, then we can skate through these things in fairly good fashion. Okay. And the ways that we would do that would be, leading up to a frost event, so we'd need good forecasting tools. We would have basically gotten spray mineral foliar fertilizers like fish and micronutrients and other potassium and stuff to just kind of supercharge it and get it into the plant itself. Mm-hmm. And the more minerals that are there, just like salt water. I mean, salt water doesn't freeze at 32 degrees. It's going to freeze at whatever the concentration of the salt allows it to freeze at.
Right.
So that's one thing. And then the other would be to think about applying biologically some non-ice nucleating bacteria to the surface of the plant. And these exist, we know what they are.
Got it.
To outcompete the ice nucleating bacteria.
Right.
Because once you get that first crystal of ice, then it just kind of takes off that way.
Right.
And then the other is actually just applying sugar, and that would help to reduce the freezing point or the accumulation of ice on the surface of the plant as well.
Yeah.
So I think those three things, but we have to be prepared to go out and really get at it.
Right.
And then kind of the fourth thing, which gets more into this biodynamic realm, is the use of valerian. And that's where we start talking about kind of the cosmic warmth, if you will, of applying valerian the night before a frost. You're bringing in this cosmic warmth, which, you can, it's associated, valerian's associated with Jupiter, light, opportunity, phosphorus. And when you think about it, light, warmth, phosphorus, they use it. You can start fires with phosphorus. There's more than just, I think, a mild cosmic connection to that, to how it can help prevent, frost. It's only going to give you a certain amount of protection, but it's just another tool that we need to, I think, start considering.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Do you know anybody that tried this time, or they had the warning to do anything?
No, I don't actually.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I do. One.
Okay.
Todd Cavallo.
Really?
He rung me up and he had said, "What can I do to kind of help this?" I said, realizing it was the night before, I think it was when he called me. I said, just add some sugar, add some molasses to your spray when you go out and spray, and see what happens. And if you've been to his place, it's a very flat site, so if there's going to be a frost, it's going to be there.
Yeah.
And it seemed some of the primary shoots seemed to come through okay, and others didn't. So
results,
yeah.
Maybe.
And I can't say that anybody else tried it, but
Todd's at Wild Ark.
Yeah, Wild Ark,
yeah.
And then Seth Jones up at East Hollow, he was going to try, and actually a biodynamic client I have in the Hudson Valley was going to. They were both going to try valerian, but it was both it was too windy for my one biodynamic client, and it was going to just get too cold for Seth to be able to apply it. So there are constraints in terms of what you can actually do and expect out of something. But I think that looking at this going forward, we just need to kind of have that arsenal ready to go. And if it doesn't happen, all the better. But if it does, we're ready to go.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, we were at Eve's with Autumn and Ezra last night, and Autumn said it was 25 degrees for 5 hours. So would that even help would this stuff help, or is it more thinking bigger picture, like diversifying the orchard and, having multiple things when those kind of things happen, right? Because, I mean, how do you, I don't know, like that's based on the range that you said of protection you might get to skate through. That sounds like it would be out of that range in the bad sense, potentially.
It could be, and I think a lot of it depends on when you start, like with some of those applications. So you can't start when it's 25, but if you start when it's 32, and actually with some of the mineral sprays, if you start a couple days ahead, you're building up that protection, layering that protection in. Now, we don't know if it's going to work because nobody's done the research, but conceptually it makes sense.
Got it.
And we know things like kelp sprays, for example, which are very rich in certain plant growth hormones as well as certain types of minerals. In some areas, I've heard, where was it? Maybe I can't remember. It wasn't in the United States. It was someplace else. Somebody sent me this, but where they've used kelp sprays before a frost and freeze event, and they've been quite successful at preventing it. So,
and observationally, what I noticed, we walked a bunch of land this week, and where we saw apples were at a high elevation site where it's, it was like the highest elevation in the area, so everything sort of sloped away from it. And tons of apples there. It was like around 2,000, like that 1,900 to 2,000 feet. And then on a piece of property that a lot of the apples were impacted, the trees, we saw a tree that was up against in a little corner with hardwoods around and partially over it. That shelter seemed to protect it. It had apples on it as well, even though other trees on the property had none. So I don't know, those were some observational things.
Well, I think that was one of the other things, as you were saying, that it came to mind is I think we need to rethink tree and vine architecture.
Yeah.
Because what we don't, when you have, particularly with grapes, where you have sort of just a vertical trellis, early in the season, you don't have any canopy. So any heat that's on the ground is just going to go right up. And particularly that night, where it was very clear, if my recollection's right, I think it was, the heat just goes, through the roof. And so over this one vineyard that I'm helping get established in the Hudson Valley, it's a good site. It's both high elevation and got good drainage and air movement. So that's working in its favor already. But we're thinking of kind of this Watson trellis approach. One, because he wants to run sheep through there eventually, but also as a way to create more of a horizontal element to that trellis to help capture some of that heat. And the same thing with high density apples. You're just not going to be able to capture any ground heat at that point. But apart from that, there's so much warmth that's captured in the soil leading up to an event like that, particularly this year where we had a lot of warm events, that if we can figure out how to release that at the right time, capture it in the tree or the trellis canopy, we have that potential. And that kind of is that you have the overhead structure, which helped protect the trees, but also if you can do something with the tree and trellis architecture to capture any heat coming up.
Okay.
So I think there's a lot of things we can do, and we don't have to. When I think about releasing heat, we could do things like just run a disc over it, just to create frozen the soil. I think ideally it would be good to either do like a 3-tine subsoiler or even a keyline plow, which will really allow some of that heat to come up.
Interesting.
Yeah. Again, nobody's explored this, and it would be a lot of work. You'd have to be prepared to do it, and you want to release that heat at the right time. But,
Right, and I also, I'm just thinking of all kinds of stuff, like if you have a really active compost pile that you can start spreading out, right? Before a event or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing, barring using all of these, and let's say they all fail, it seems like, going back to what we're standing next to, like diversification, instead of just thinking of yourself as an apple grower, this is what I've been talking about with like some other orchardists. They're like, we're not going to be apple growers anymore. We're going to be sheep farmers, apple growers, like duck farmers. And something's going to pan out that year. We don't know which one, but we won't count on any of them, kind of thing, where it's like having multiple things seems like kind of the way forward. Because the other thing I keep hearing is like, we've never seen, like, this is the first time I've ever seen this in my lifetime event kind of thing. And I'm like, I'm beginning to realize this is probably a phrase we're going to hear every year now in some different way for some different event.
Right.
For the foreseeable future. It's like, it's never been this bad before, And so it's like, how do you survive that kind of a future, where it's just continual extremes, setting records every year in some terrible way, whether it's fires in California or floods or droughts. Like, we've gone back and forth. The wettest winter this past winter, before that the driest winter.
Right.
Or the driest year and the wettest year. So.
Well, I think, and this will come across as a little dry, I think, to some people, but all of farming is basically risk management. And everything you do is just an insurance policy.
Yeah.
And so, when we think about drought, if you don't have a way to get water, especially to young trees, then I don't think you're being a good risk manager as a farmer. If you're not spraying your trees somehow, you're not being a good risk manager. I think that, and look, I have very good friends that believe in an absolute no spray approach. But the fact is that outside of a couple of species, apples are not native to the United States. And a lot of the pests that are here are not native to where they came from. And so there's none of this evolutionary synchrony to allow the trees to be able to adapt as quickly as possible to some of these pressures that are here. So they're in and it's only been a few hundred years. When we talk about evolution, we're talking about, tens of thousands of years for new species to really develop, for things to truly genetically diversify and adapt. And so I think we've kind of boiled everything down to, are we talking about true genetic adaptation, or are we talking about ecological adaptation? And I'm all for plant breeding. I think this is great. I know that, everybody who's doing that kind of stuff, whether it's in grapes or apples, it's a tremendous lift, and we have tools that we can use to speed up that process. But it still takes years to be able to get a new variety, developed and tested and then released, and does it work? There are people like my friend Matt Kaminsky, who's he's out there in the world collecting varieties, from the central Massachusetts area, and I've got a friend in Vermont who's doing the same. And I think that's, these locally adapted varieties, they're not necessarily genetically distinct, because I bet if we ran the DNA, they'd be very close to varieties that are not well adapted to that climate or didn't survive well. But what they are is ecologically adapted. They have just enough of a push in one direction or the other to make them more viable in that area. But even if you took that variety, which is locally adapted, and used it in a breeding program, it's going to take years before you figure out whether you brought the right genes over, into that. And I totally support that.
Yeah.
But for me to be able to go out and work with different plants and to work with the soil health and the environment, that stuff I can do every year. I can do that every day that I'm out there in the field, while we also do this other work, which is kind of on a longer timeline.
Right.
And that'll help us, I think, also begin to help our orchards and us begin to adapt and survive some of these big swings in climate.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that was a fun exploration.
Yeah.
Because I feel it's so topical right now. I think it's on everybody's mind this year. I think it's really important to talk about these things. Yeah. And you just covered some great stuff that I think will be helpful for a lot of people. But you want to go back to what you're doing here? Talking about the spraying that you're doing, and just, or we can just walk and you can talk about whatever comes to mind as we walk.
Yeah.
But as we get up to this next section, what, in terms of spraying, what are you? How are you treating these guys?
Well, it's I'm very cognizant of the biological realities of growing apples, and even though I've got 130 different varieties here, they're going to be susceptible to, in varying ways, all the various diseases that are out there, the insects that are out there, And I should say that, I planted this orchard with the idea that I was in a position where I could kind of allow it to fail. So I could try things here to see if they worked before I actually recommended them to a client or a fellow grower.
Okay.
And if it did work, great. If not, then we could throw that one on the burn pile and
right.
go back. So, but the spray program it's pretty minimal in the overall scheme of things. It's very holistic. And we're relying, at this time of the year, we're relying more on some fermented plant teas that we're making. And that's like a whole other area of investigation that we're going through right now, of the different phytochemicals that different types of plants in the environment have, and right now we're focused on 6. There's 2 mucilaginous plants. There's plantain and comfrey. Oh. There's 2 bulbous plants, daffodils and garlic, and then there's 2 of the biodynamic plants, which is horsetail and nettles. And we're making fermented plant teas of all those, which is what's sitting over in those white barrels over there. Oh. And we're still putting in some manufactured products, say like double nickel, which is a biological product, and Quavo, which is a low-dose copper product, to help augment all of that. But we're really focusing on the nutritional aspects of the trees, and not just from a mineral standpoint or a brick standpoint, but from a phytochemical standpoint, because those are the things that's what gives any organism the ability to fend off certain diseases or whatever are going on. It's like using elderberry syrup. It's an immune booster, and it's not going to make you better immediately, but it will help to boost the immune system if you take it every day. And so we're using that same sort of concept in the orchard of focusing primarily on plant teas and biologicals.
Are you getting the plants from the orchard, or is that...
We're getting them from where we can find them.
Okay, some here, some there.
The comfrey we can collect here in the orchard. The nettles we collect in the orchard. The plantain you can collect anywhere, so that's not a big deal. The horsetail I buy. I buy it from the Josephine Porter Institute for Applied Biodynamics. And the garlic we're going to start to grow next year. Okay. So we'll plant it this fall, and then we'll have our own source of that, which is very interesting because it actually helps to pull things into the plant. The garlic does.
And do you use the bulbs of the daffodils, or tulips? What is it?
So daffodils and garlic were the 2 bulbous plants.
So you use the bulbs of them.
Yes. Yeah.
And what does that do? Can you talk about which each of those do for? Or are supposed to do, or are supposed to add or help with?
Sure. Well, all plants have a few basic categories of phytochemicals that are out there. There's alkaloids that are out there. There's phenolics. There's tannins. There's polysaccharides. And there's one other that's escaping my mind right now. But each of these categories brings a different effect to the plant physiology. Okay. And so in the case of like daffodils, it's always been, I guess, known, in air quotes, that if you plant daffodils around your apple tree, it'll ward off voles. And so it had me ask the question is, why is that? And so a quick Google search, a few scientific papers, and we realized that daffodils have 300 different alkaloids in them. Okay. And that those alkaloids are toxins. Probably the most famous in agriculture is nicotine, which they've banned. But alkaloids provide a modicum of, and so I think that the voles know that this is not something they want to eat. So what if we, instead of trying to plant daffodils over the entire landscape, what if we were able to take a small amount of that, concentrate that in, so it gets into kind of this isn't spagyrics, so anybody out there who knows what that is, it's like, this isn't spagyrics, but basically concentrating what those daffodils have and spraying that and trying to capture that alkaloid energy. Okay. Comfrey is in the same way, has alkaloid energy. And I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but each of those has a different set of phytochemicals that spur the plant into a higher level of its own, immune status, if you will, or resistant status. And what we're trying to do is, in addition to providing those unique substances, is we're also trying to trigger an induced systemic resistance or a systemic acquired resistance pathway in the plant that triggers its ability to produce its own internal phytochemicals.
Got it.
So we're coming from the outside with some sprays, and it's producing some on the inside.
How hard is it to ferment these? Do you just throw them in with some water? Or?
Yeah, the beauty of being married to a community herbalist and learning a lot about herbalism is we just we don't even really make a decoction. We just make a tea out of it.
Okay.
And then we'll let it ferment for a few days in like a 5-gallon bucket, and then we'll dilute it further into more water, and just over time allowing that to ferment. And we'll add more plant matter and more water if we need it. Stir it every once in a while so it stays aerobic and doesn't go anaerobic.
And do you do so very low maintenance, it sounds like. Do you do any sugar addition to activate the biology in there of any kind?
Well, no, we actually don't. We do when we do EM1 or if we're doing any like true biological. Okay. But for these, we're not adding sugar or anything, and in part it's because the plants have their own sugars.
Yeah.
And so it's like doing a wild yeast fermentation with cider or wine. I mean, you're just taking what comes in on the apple or the cluster and seeing what happens. But also just time and it's sitting in there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the longest amount of time that it might sit?
Oh, that'll last all season.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I mean, we'll start them as early as we can. This year we're going to dry a bunch of the herbs so that next spring we can start it even earlier.
Oh, fantastic.
So we don't have to wait for them to grow out in the spring going like, well, where are the nettles? But we'll do some of that this year or this fall.
Okay.
Or throughout the season. We'll dry them as they come in, and then we'll have some next spring, and then we'll use fresh as well.
And it looks like you have them on the south side of the orchard, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're in the shade a little bit up against the trees there?
Yeah, we didn't want them to be
baked,
and I didn't want them to be totally in the dark. I wanted a little bit of heat, but
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Nice.
So and the understory part, and so I guess the other part of that story is, the understory is we're allowing different types of plants to come in and establish themselves, and allowing the ones that we feel have the most benefit to this non-specific guild, if you will, to dominate that part. Because from a herbalist standpoint, plants that show up, particularly if they show up in numbers, are telling you something about what that area needs.
Right.
So if you're seeing a lot of dandelions or daisies or plantain or whatever, it's telling you quite a bit about what that particular area needs or that land needs. And which is actually a good thing to say, because where we're standing right now, everything in this direction was old vineyard when I planted the orchard. And when we worked up the ground, we would get old grape roots and stuff. I mean, it had been cleared, but we were still finding lots of roots.
Yeah.
But everything to the west, down the hill, this was like old, just kind of scrubby pine forest, and had some actually fairly large pine trees on it, which we cleared. So as far as I know, it was never vineyard.
Okay.
But each of these areas, the trees are growing differently. There's different types of plants that are coming up. We can see that there's yarrow, there's some valerian, there's some Queen Anne's lace that's coming in. So it's kind of interesting to see how these two sections are changing, because this is still recovering from the trees that we pulled out of it, 8 years ago.
Now, why is this open? Why has this not been planted, and why are you mowing it instead of letting it grow?
The idea from the beginning has been kind of also to be able to do workshops here.
Okay.
So I wanted to have kind of a teaching space. We are going to build a small kind of equipment shed here this summer and put in a composting toilet and stuff.
Okay. Nice.
But this is just basically a place where we could be kind of in the center of the orchard and do some teaching and workshops.
Great.
Got
it.
Yeah.
Do you want to walk up?
Let's keep doing that.
So you're tying down some of these instead of trellising them. Tying down some.
Right. Well, the idea is that whenever you pull down a branch, you're essentially weakening it, but you're shifting the the plant growth hormone balance in the tree away from something that's vegetative, if it's growing more upright, to something that's going to set spurs and flower buds for next year. And this is, I mean, it's a very common practice with trellised apples where you're tying branches down.
Got it. Here
So,
you just
or-
have to literally, like a tent stake with a rope down
Yep.
to the ground.
Yep.
Nice.
Yep. And I mean, it had a gorgeous bloom on it this year, like a lot of people's did, and
Now there's nothing.
but you know, the plus side is that it's going to have a really good bloom next year.
We hope.
Yes.
Barring some other catastrophic event.
Always the optimist. Yes.
I love it. Yeah, no, it's funny. I was talking to Eric at Redbird, and he was like, yeah, we've got a few apples left. But he's like, I'm not even counting on those. We might get hail in September and destroy the rest of the apples that we have. He's like, until they're on the press, we have no apples.
Yeah. Well, Eric's also a good friend, and he's like, he's one I think that mentally and philosophically, he's like up for whatever nature is going to give him in that given year.
Yeah.
And Redbird is designed to do that. And he's a wonderful grower, very insightful, person, and I love talking with him. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Great. Well, do you want to tell more about what's going on here, or anything?
yeah. Well, so the property that we're on, we actually just bought it last month. And it's about, so there's these 4 fields. There's kind of the 2 that you passed as you just drove in, and the 2 up above this road. It's about maybe 15 acres or so, but there's another 35 acres in that direction.
Okay.
Where I'm just beginning to kind of get to learn it. And I'm also a mushroom enthusiast, so I'm all the downed wood and stuff. I'm very interested in finding out where the maitake is, and
Oh, wow. Have
hopefully
you seen some?
not yet.
Yeah.
Hopefully that might, I'll find that little chanterelle paradise and
Nice. Yes.
that kind of stuff.
Have you read The Mushroom at the End of the World?
I haven't. Who's that?
It's about maitake.
Okay.
And like the global trade that evolved around maitake, and it's a talk about the collapse of capitalism. Not the collapse, but the being on the downside of capitalism and a global economy, and how people are finding, a way to make a living at the margins, and being.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really really fascinating book. I mean, and if you like mushrooms, it's worth checking out, especially maitake. And it talks about how they originate in disturbed landscapes, so they're kind of like this great metaphor for this, declining capitalism. Regeneration, or sustenance within like a landscape that has been degraded or disturbed,
Right.
in big and small ways. Fun book. Anyway,
Very cool. Yeah, I'll have to get that book. And we've got our mushroom yard, shiitake yard over here, and there's more down below and that kind of stuff.
nice.
I see we have a little fire blight coming in.
Oh, where? Let's see that. Oh, is that what these brown
Yeah.
death is?
Yep.
That's not related to freeze. That's fire blight.
Well, there's this whole thing that's kind of popped up in conversation of freeze-induced fire blight, because we did have blossoms out when the frost came through, and we are seeing fire blight in areas that we wouldn't normally expect it, but yet here it is. And this is Dabinette, and this is Benet Rouge, one of those late blooming French varieties, so it was probably in bloom right as the frost hit. So we kind of got whacked in 2 different ways. One is that you had the trees that were in bloom when the freeze hit, which didn't kill the flowers, but now we've got the fire blight. It didn't kill the flowers 100%, which is a little bit of an odd thing. But anything that had fruitlets on it, which was earlier blooming, didn't get fire blight, but most of the fruitlets got frozen. So
Autumn mentioned that as well last night, about how some of the things that were already had little fruitlets got toasted, but the ones that were in flower, a lot of them survived.
Right.
And
it's a water content issue, and we have a local Finger Lakes discussion group online, and we were discussing this, and it seems to be at that point we were in a very low humidity environment, and if it had been higher humidity, it wouldn't have been bad. It wouldn't the freeze wouldn't have been as bad to the fruitlets, but that water just froze so quickly. Anything that was in the fruit, whereas you're much more. I think and I don't know this for certain, but I think the sugars are much more concentrated in the flowers, and so they didn't freeze as easily because it's like almost all sugar at that point because there's no like real water in the flower. So this I wanted to bring up. This is an interesting little, and this gets down to the R&E part of what Apostrophe is here for. Is that one of my clients in New Jersey, his daughter is a student at Cornell, and she's very interested in plant-insect interactions and what it has to do with soil health. And I've been interested in picking up this project that was done about 8 years ago at this point by a guy in the Hudson Valley with the Hawthorne Valley Farmscape Ecology Program, where he was looking at different management styles on the biodiversity in orchards. And while we couldn't replicate that study, what we did is there's this one and another orchard that I manage over in Dryden, where we decided to set it up and just kind of let the vegetation grow. We were going to set up some different types of insect traps. She was going to do plant mapping to see what plants are here, how does that change over the course of a season, what kind of insects is she seeing, how does that differ between the two different sites. And while we don't, we know that we're not going to come to any like grand conclusion at the end of this year, it does begin to create kind of some baseline data for how do we carry this project forward in the future. And it's interesting because at the two sites, she's starting to see some differences in the kind of insects that are there. At the other orchard, it's a completely unmanaged. Well, let me rephrase that. Part of it is there's a managed orchard there, but then there's like a really old unmanaged orchard with about 300 different trees in it. Oh. So that's pretty impressive. But she's starting to see some differences between the insect types that are at the orchards. But doing like net sweeps of the ground cover, and using these malaise traps, which they're up all the time, and the insects fly into it, and then they can't get back out. They're kind of caught in those little plastic cups you see on the top.
So it's just a collection device, basically.
Yeah, but
somebody was camping out here.
It does. It very much looks like a tent. But the nice thing is we can monitor nocturnal insects that we aren't going to normally get when she's out during the day. Right. And then she's also using something called a Berlese funnel, which we're taking soil samples and putting them into a funnel and putting a light on top of it, which essentially drives the insects down into a collection cup. And she's seeing different types of insects that are coming through that process as well. So, we don't know a whole lot at this point, but there's starting to become some interesting differences between the two sites.
Do you know the Ecdysis Foundation?
I've heard of it, yeah.
They're doing a lot of, it's basically data collection at the moment, but you might want to, definitely somebody to talk to and compare data with and stuff like that, because they're doing very similar stuff. And actually some of your stuff sounds like even a little more in depth in terms of insect collection, because I think they're doing sweeps and stuff like that. But this sounds, anyway, really great thing. They're trying to collect data from 1,000 different farms all in every environment in North America, and so they're getting this huge data set that I think they've been at it a few years, and they're already seeing they're going to be able to put data behind claims that are being made, and as well as just like this is clearly adding soil. They're doing soil, they're doing insect, they're doing bird data. I forget what else they're doing, but they're collecting data about more than just insects. So maybe that's it's a broader, maybe not as deep, but definitely.
And that's what the Farmscape Ecology program did. They were looking at birds and bats and other types of things. Okay. And one of the interesting things that they came up with was that they were recording sounds at night to find out what was out there, and conventional orchards were like dead silent at night, whereas organic orchards were like a cacophony of different things, and they were able to pick up different bat sounds as well, and they were able to identify different bat species that way. And I believe it was all using Cornell's Ornithology Lab's program called Raven, which can record and then interpret. I think that's
Oh, that's really cool.
But that was like one of the most intriguing things to me is like conventional orchards are just dead, and that also clued me into I think really wrapping my head around the fact that like almost all the activity that goes on in an orchard, insect-wise, bird-wise, bat-wise, happens at night.
Yeah.
So we're only seeing a fraction of what's actually going on in here.
Yeah, animal-wise.
Animal-wise.
Right.
Yeah, I think we have a bear in the woods.
Yeah.
And somebody spotted a black fisher in the neighborhood too, which was very weird. And somebody said there's been reports of porcupines. So, the rewilding of the Hector, New York. So,
I was talking to somebody. Well, I was talking to a guy who did bats, and he had observations in California of the bats literally just flying over a conventional vineyard, like a huge conventional, just flying straight over it, and to get to like a riparian area to hunt. So they weren't even trying to hunt in the conventional vineyard because there's like nothing to hunt there. It was just a dead zone for insects and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then you also, this whole idea of like, it's like we're out here and we think like, oh, look at this wonderful teeming thing. And then at night, like the party starts. Once we're out of here, everybody's like, all right, they're gone. Come on out. Like, let's have some fun. That's fun.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of the parents go to bed and the kids come out and play sort of thing. But the idea behind this project is to create that baseline and really carry it on as kind of a long-term ecological project, and possibly apply for, well, not possibly, but the idea would be to apply for SARE funding to be able to carry it on as kind of a grower-driven research project. And the good thing is that we've got a couple of professors at Cornell that we're collaborating with on this in various levels. One I've worked with for a number of years on pollinator studies. The other is I know who he is, and we've met a couple of times, but is more in kind of this plant insect interaction world. But the idea would be let's have a party at night here, and how do we do that? If we have to put a keg out here, we'll do that.
Right. I like that, and what I'm observing that people can't see is like you've mowed the aisles in a couple aisles, and then there's a couple that aren't mowed, and you're collecting in the unmowed aisle. At least that collection site is. So, what's thinking behind that?
About the unmowed part?
Yeah.
Oh, just I don't want to disturb the insects that are foraging in there or whatever. It was. There's a practical side.
So it's for the insects?
It's for the insects. It's for, we want the plants to continue to grow and diversify. Reseed, all that kind of stuff. But it's basically just to not disturb the collection process.
Okay.
Whereas here, it was just getting difficult to do any work when it was this high.
Right.
And ticks were all over the place.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Wow, you're the first person that said that. We haven't seen any except on a dog, and we've been walking all kinds of land, and we check ourselves religiously after our hikes, and haven't seen one yet. So you're the first person to say that. Yeah. You have a special spot.
Well, it's not loaded with ticks, but one of my employees has had Lyme disease 4 times already, and so I have to be cognizant that there's a worker safety issue, and it's I found one on me the other day that had already embedded itself, and I'd only been out for like 2 hours.
Whoa.
Yeah.
We'll check ourselves.
Yes.
Constantly.
This is why we're walking in the mowed part of the orchard. Yes.
Got it. Makes sense. I like that.
Yes. So
so we're at the top.
Yeah, these were the first trees that were planted. I planted this and worked my way down. There have been some replacements. I've allowed the trees to basically grow the way they wanted to, and apart from some training and stuff, I just didn't want to get in the middle of what they were going to naturally do.
And they're now 7 years old, 8 years old?
These were planted in 2016,
Okay.
so the grafting started in 2015, and then they were out in the field for a year or two. No, I think maybe they were actually planted in 2017. That's right, because they were in my backyard until 2017. Then I dug them and planted them that spring in 2017.
Okay.
And I did start with some trees that I bought from Cummins Nursery, in addition to my grafted stuff.
Now, you mentioned buying one of your plant elements from the Institute for Applied. Can you talk about that Institute for Applied Biodynamics and what your role is there? Because aren't you pretty active with them?
Yeah, so, and I love the view. It's
It is a nice view.
Yeah. Yeah, the Josephine Porter Institute for Applied Biodynamics is now in, I think it's 36th year. It was started in the early 80s by a guy named Hugh Courtney, who was probably the preeminent biodynamic preparation maker in the United States at that time. He was very, very much of a practical farmer, but also an alchemist, and it was named after Josephine Porter, who she was also a biodynamic farmer and preparation maker, and yeah. Anyway, so it got started, and it started out small, but basically they were making preparations to be able to sell to the broader public. They had a publication called Applied Biodynamics, which allowed for articles to be written on, the making of biodynamic preparations, the utilization of biodynamic preparations, some of the more cosmic aspects of what was going on, the anthroposophical side of biodynamics. And in the last 34 years, it's grown into what it is today, which is, much larger and more complex of an organization. I joined JPI in 2016, I think, as an editor for Applied Biodynamics, and I have, moved up in the organization, and I'm now in my second year as president of JPI. Yeah. And we're in the process of going through some, as a lot of organizations do, of reorganization and reinventing ourselves, but always maintaining the overall objective of producing significant volumes of biodynamic preparations at the highest quality that we can. And that's always a process, because there's some very precise protocols when it comes to making biodynamic preparations, but it's still also very much of an evolutionary process, and very, I think, dependent on where you are, in the world locally.
Right.
Like I know biodynamic preparation makers that are making preparations at 9,000 feet in Colorado or in Australia or South America.
Right.
And they have access to different plants, the climate's different, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Got it. Now, where are we in the world right here? I don't think we established where this land actually sits.
Yeah, well, we're in Hector, New York, on the east side of Seneca Lake, kind of, I guess it's about 12 miles north of Watkins Glen. And we can see to the other side of Seneca, but this is basically grape country. And, there's not many orchards around Seneca Lake. Probably the most substantial would be Red Jacket Orchards, which is up in Geneva. But apart from that, this is wine grape country, and some table grapes thrown in too.
Yeah.
So, but central New York, Finger Lakes, we're 20 miles from Ithaca, 12 miles from Watkins Glen.
Looking west towards Seneca Lake.
Yep,
right?
yeah. And if we were 25 feet tall, we probably could see the lake.
Right.
Or had a helicopter or something.
Now, so you mentioned high vibrational food and beverage.
Mm-hmm.
Just transitioning us. How did you get to that point? And what does that mean to you? And how did you get to that point coming from the background that you did? I know, you've already talked a little bit about your journey, but was it a step-by-step process, or and where are you with that now?
Well,
I know it's like 10 questions.
It's like 10 questions that I'll answer in 100 answers.
Perfect.
Yeah. Well, how did I get to that point? So I think a lot of it is that as I started to break out of this box that I felt like I was in for the first 20 years of my career, and to think more expansively and more holistically, and I got into biodynamics and other things, I came to this, and it was also sort of an exploration of certain, spirituality. Oh yeah, the strawberries are like all over the place. I began to realize that everything is, it's the web of life. It's all energetic. I mean, when you get it down to kind of the quantum or quark level, I mean, it's all just about the flow of energy. And, we can think about that in a really woo-woo sort of way, or we can think about it, the reality is that there's electrochemical reactions that are going on, in nature and in our bodies and between ourselves all the time. And 10 years ago, when I was a bit more able to do things like sprint triathlons and I was swimming a lot and whatnot, I started listening to a podcast by a guy named Rich Roll, who brings a lot of these concepts in from a human perspective. Not necessarily, well, he has some farmers on there, but mostly it's from a human perspective. But just thinking about...
You just distinguished between a farmer and a human there.
Well, I mean,
distinction.
Human health, how humans take care of themselves from a health standpoint versus farmers who are taking care of a farm and crops. Yeah, right. Yeah. There's those AI farmers out there.
Right.
Yeah. That's probably not too far in our future. Well, actually, if you follow,
it's the present, right? In
yeah.
some places, yeah.
When you look at high tech stuff, anyway, so I started thinking about it. It brought a lot more things into focus and raised some more questions about. It wasn't just what we were doing to grow the crops that we had. It wasn't just organic. It was about what is that actually doing to the plant, to the crop, to the environment, and what does that mean not just to human health, but to the health of the world. Mm-hmm. And I mean the earth is an organism.
Right.
And so then you get into this whole concept of high vibrational food, and there's a big part of it that is like it is how it's grown. And so organic is one way, conventional is another, biodynamic is a way, holistic, completely non-spray is another. It's about the environment that it's being grown in, how healthy that is that. There's a lot of organic farms out there which are basically just industrial landscapes for growing whatever they happen to be growing. And then it's also the intention that the person puts into it. And so when you're really leaning into the work and focused on doing the best that you can in the best way possible with the highest intention, then you elevate the energetic value of that food or beverage to a higher level. There's lots of kale in the world, or spinach, or apples, or grapes for that matter. But if you're not really paying attention to why you're doing what you're doing, and you're not doing it in the best way possible, there's going to be a different energetic potential within that food.
Yeah.
And so I think about that a lot, particularly with what I'm doing here, with what other people are doing, and with the clients that I work with, of how are they leaning into the work? How are they applying the recommendations that I make? Or how are they thinking about, okay, so how can I take this to another level? So instead of just like applying fertilizer, even an organic dry fertilizer, how can I do something like using compost or compost teas or plant teas, or doing indigenous microbe work to bring more of the environment, more of that natural energy into the system?
Yeah.
And even microbial, I do a lot of lab tests. Well, I don't do them. I send them send them to a lab to do them, but I interpret them. And I've started to send almost routinely, as long as the grower approves of the cost, of sending soil samples in to have biological assessments done of that soil. What's the biological life? What's the biological health of that soil? And invariably, it's pretty low. There's not much going on there. That's not 100% true, but more often than not, if there is enough total fungal and bacterial levels in the soil, they're just barely optimal, or the ratios are not right. It's more bacterial than fungal, which in a perennial ecosystem we want to have a more fungally driven type of soil. And then when you start looking at the aerobic bacteria and the aerobic fungi, oftentimes those are below the optimal levels that are set. And so how do we go about not only just bringing the biological components to a higher level, but how do we get more aerobic activity going in there? And a lot of that, this is why, I don't think that you can just not do anything with a piece of land. You have to work with it, intervene, guide, steward, whatever the word is, to help it improve itself.
Right.
It'll do it in time eventually. I mean, in 10,000 years, this is going to look far different than it does today. But this is what old growth forests are about. I mean, it took them thousands of years to get to that point where they have these really strong, fungally driven and rich, aerobic soils that drive all this diversity, which is why old growth forests are so important to global biodiversity. Yeah. And you've probably experienced it, but I remember watching, I think it was Fantastic Fungi, when Paul Stamets was walking through the orchard, where you could just literally feel the soil bounce underneath your feet, and that's because there's all that aerobic activity that's going on under there.
And there's so many practical reasons to go for that as well. I mean, they're finding, of course, with the mycelium is what's preventing, or it helps drought tolerance, because you have this whole network of things that are holding the moisture in the soil, mining elements that the trees can't get too deep in the soil. I mean, just anecdotally, like, I've been thinking, I hadn't, when you brought this up, I was like, oh, this is right up my alley, but I don't have any particular thoughts. But actually, I realized I have had a lot of thoughts, because I didn't know what you meant about it. But like, I just noticed, as a drinker of wine specifically, I drink a wider variety of things. Like, I don't buy things for myself that are not grown with intention and love and ecological awareness and stuff like that anymore. But I often taste them, and I've noticed that when I've been to friends' house who are pouring wine, that I'm just drinking whatever they're pouring for me. Those are the nights, and I know it's not the kind of wine that I would buy. Those are the nights when I get a hangover, or like it's not necessarily a hangover. I'm never drinking that much, or I'm just like hammered. But I wake up the next day, and I have like I'm starting to get these weird sinus-related migraine type things, but they're often triggered by wine, but not usually the kind of wine that I like to buy myself. And I started thinking that too. I was like, I can think about how these were probably made, and they probably weren't like high intervention. I mean, yes, they're conventional wines, so there's probably filtration, all these things. But I think, like, honestly, I was like, I'm beginning to think that the difference is really just in the energy with which they were produced, like the intention with which they were produced. Because it's like, I know, that, like, really, like, when you just get down to a molecular level, like alcohol, if you drink too much alcohol, it's not, I don't have a sulfate allergy. I know, I'm not drinking enough alcohol to be like hungover in that way from alcohol toxicity. So then it's like, what is it? Like, what is causing these headaches and this thing to trigger in me that I wake up feeling bad the next day? And I think this is, like, anecdotally what people talk about with natural wine a lot of times is like, oh, it doesn't give you a hangover. And it's like, well, any wine will give you a hangover. Just drink enough of it,
Sure.
But if you're drinking wine that is made with intention, and it's an intention, the intentionality that you're talking about, a higher level intentionality, maybe that translates to the wine. I mean, this is where my mind has been going. So the fact that you're saying all this is really, really intriguing. Like, because I feel it. I feel like you can feel it. Like, if you start paying attention, if you drink enough wine like I do, or too much, it's really interesting.
Well, I mean, I think it speaks to kind of a larger idea that I don't subscribe to, and you don't, and a lot of people we know don't, but that humans are not a part of nature.
Right,
and it's the same thing, any Nimrod can crush some grapes and throw some yeast in there and put it in a carboy and, ferment something.
Right.
But if they're really not leaning into with the work with intention, thinking about what they're doing, and especially with the way the grapes were grown, you're just making fermented grape juice with alcohol. You might as well go buy some Welch's and pour some vodka in it. But I think that intentional part, because we are a part of that whole process. It's the growing of the grapes, how they're grown, what you're doing when you're out there in the field with it. And I think this speaks to this is like, when we talk about like high tech in agriculture, when you get these really fancy tractors or even robotic tractors where the farmer never sets foot in this field because it's all GPS and they can plant and harvest and spray without ever, how can they know what's going on out there? How can they be a part of that process other than sitting in a computer screen? That part I just don't get, and I mean, I'll be the first to admit I don't get to spend as much time in this orchard as I would like, but enough to where I'm a part of what's going on here. And I think there's another thing is that this concept that especially conventional pesticides, but all pesticides, even organic, to some degree, I think mute the energetic level of the plant because they don't, in the same way, like if, I don't know, if you were just taking prophylactically antibiotics for whatever stupid reason, you're not allowing your body, your immune system, to build up to a high enough level. And by using these pesticides, we're not allowing the plant to grow, to develop its immune system to a high enough level. And so we have to think about that. And that's where I think that while even organic sprays, even some of the bio sprays that I use, like double nickel, can be considered to be allopathic, I still think that they're more expansive. They open up opportunities in a way that other types of pesticides don't, because they shut down the ability of that plant to be what it needs to be.
I think about this all the time. Like, I'm really starting to get bummed out even just spraying sulfur, in California on our vines, because it's like I'm beginning to think with this intention thing. It's like anything like that comes from this intention to suppress or eradicate or eliminate or disrupt. It's like a negative energy. Like we want to focus on the bad and try to screw with it so it can't be good, or so it can't thrive, as opposed to the opposite. Focusing on the positive, having the intention to build vibrancy and build resistance and resilience in the plant. To activate like probiotic elements, to activate like the genetic, and epigenetic elements of the plants. I think about that all the time now. And it's like I almost feel like I feel the plants that way. Like I'm beginning to get maybe to that extent where it's like I really don't think the vines are crazy about sulfur. Like I just look at them and they're just sort of like, they're like meh, as opposed to when I've done like a compost tea spray or something like that, it feels different. It just has a different energy, and the vines seem to respond differently to it, which sounds really weird, but like, I don't know. Maybe I'm an empath.
No, well, I mean, but I look at these trees and what we've been doing to them the past few years, how we've been managing it, and the reality is like they look beautiful. I use Cueva just because it has some unique characteristics to it, and it is copper, so it's kind of in that sulfur realm. But I use so little of it that it's just like it's almost irrelevant. But when I look at these trees and I look how healthy they are, it's like we're in a way we're helping to create something as opposed to dissolve something. We're not dissolving the plant's ability to take care of itself. We're creating greater potential, and it needs to be nurtured. I mean, we can't. I think it's somewhat naive to think that as farmers that we shouldn't intervene. But I think, this goes to like a Masanobu Fukuoka approach. He's, his whole do nothing approach. Right. And just like, I don't know if he was quoted or I'm paraphrasing it, but basically he said, do nothing approach doesn't mean to do nothing. It just means to do as little as possible, intervene as little as possible. And that's kind of what I try and do here. And I'm just, apart from the little bit of fire blight, which is a different deal, I'm blown away by how vibrant the trees look this year. So
Yeah,
you know,
they look
and
great. They do look great.
and it's the same thing with the orchard understory. I mean, you know, in a conventional orchard, and even some organic orchards. I mean, the quote unquote weeds, the plants underneath the trees, you know, they're eradicated. You know, whether it's through mechanical means or chemical means or whatever. And fertilizers are put down, and it's still a very allopathic mindset. I wrote an article about this for Malice magazine about shifting consciousness. That even on the organic level, we need to figure out how do we get out of this spraying mindset from a suppressive, like you were saying, like from a suppressive perspective, and more into a progressive, a growth perspective of helping the plant. Because even though I said earlier that plant breeding takes years to really get new varieties in there, there is the reality that most of these plants in here probably do have some genes which aren't just being triggered on.
Yeah.
And that's where I think a lot of this comes in, and you can't put your finger on it. Well, I suppose on some level you can. Like, what do we do to help trigger the right genes in here so that it's...
Oh my God. Sorry.
So that there's you know, less susceptibility to apple scab or less susceptibility to codling moth or anything along those, or in the case of grapes, less susceptibility to downy mildew. You know, how do we trigger those genes if they're there? And I think the only way we can do that is to nurture the plants, to get them to their highest potential, highest vibrational potential through working with soil health, both in terms of additions, biological additions, compost, you know, indigenous microbes, but also the sprays on the tree, the plants that grow under the tree, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And
I mean, really aligns with everything that I am thinking too about. I mean, like you were talking about, once you kind of understand that sort of quantum physics, it's all energy expressing in different ways. And then you realize, well, like all the different ways that we approach it are sort of metaphoric anyway. So we're all pointing at the same thing. We're using different language, whether it's like a religious language or a, you know, biodynamic something, you know, that language, or new agey or whatever, or whether it's the language of science, but that is starting to touch on these things. You know, yeah, it really feels like just metaphors, you know, metaphors for what we're, for the same thing. And it's really interesting to me.
And we have to figure out, you know, what works best for each of us, because, you know, my site's different than Autumn's site, which is different than Eric's site, which is different than Alfie's site, you know, or something like that.
And you're all different people.
And we're all different people,
which
yeah.
I think you're saying is another really important element to any farm, which is like what the energy that you bring, the intention, the impact and intervention that you bring is part of the farm. It shouldn't, and it's positive. I mean, it can be positive. It can be beneficial. Should be part of the farm, and should inspire us to probably a sense of responsibility and care, like carefulness, because we're not just like, you know, we're not. You can't remove yourself from it, first of all, and then once you admit that, then you know whether you are trying to make an impact or not. You are, and so you should think about that impact and think about how you can make it the best impact it can be, and how you can help enhance, you know, be part of a system that is. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to paraphrase what you're saying or restate it, but you go on. You were talking about the different. Everybody's farm is different.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's like a biodynamic principle, is that the farm individuality. I mean, you know, and the farmer being a part of the farm, you know, that we are a part of that. It's not just about the trees and the flowers and whatnot. It's about us as well, and the surrounding environment. I mean, it wasn't just Steiner, but it was other people who talked about how, I mean, life lives on the edges. I mean, very prominent ecologists in wilderness areas talk about how life is on the edges. So how can we bring more of that in to the orchard without, you know, shading the orchard out that, you know, it never photosynthesizes? And I think that's a challenge as well.
I love that. Well, this taps into, and maybe a good transition to the thing that I'm very passionate about, which is vines and growing vines with trees, which I think is part of that forest edge ecology. And, you know, two species that have been married for most of their life until, you know, we separated them recently. And I love, and you have some stuff going around here, right? Some wild riparia that you have plans to do something with?
I do.
Well, that's the end of part 1. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Thanks for listening. And if you're interested to find out what happens next when Mike and I leave the orchard and enter the forest, it becomes a very different conversation and very interesting. And I'm just going to leave this as a cliffhanger, and you'll have to tune in to part 2 coming out later this week. Thanks so much for listening. To be continued.